A new deep-sea survey of the USS Indianapolis has revealed unprecedented details about the warship's final moments. Advanced imaging technology has mapped every torpedo wound, every collapsed bulkhead, every piece of debris scattered across the sea floor. But the cameras captured something else, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The Indianapolis rests under 18,000 feet of water in the Philippine Sea. That's nearly a mile deeper than the Titanic. At that depth, the pressure exceeds 8,000 pounds per square inch. Enough to crush a submarine like an aluminum can. Enough to flatten a human body into something unrecognizable in a fraction of a second. It's a place of absolute darkness, absolute silence, absolute death. So what could possibly be making noise down there? A recent submersible mission exploring the wreck not only filmed something deeply disturbing inside the ship, but also recorded sounds that defy explanation. Sounds that suggest the Indianapolis is not as dead as history claims. This footage has been kept from public release, but we're about to reveal what the cameras saw and the terrifying truth of what's really happening to America's most haunted shipwreck. You already know the story, or you think you do. July 1945. The Indianapolis completes a secret mission delivering components for the atomic bomb that would destroy Hiroshima. Days later, a Japanese submarine puts 2 torpedoes into her hull. She sinks in 12 minutes. Nearly 900 men go into the water. For the next 4.5 days, they float in the open ocean under the brutal Pacific sun. Dehydration, exposure, and sharks. Hundreds of oceanic whitetips descend on the survivors in what becomes the deadest shark attack in recorded history. When rescue finally arrives, only 316 men are still alive. The thing nobody tells you is that the math doesn't add up. The Navy estimated shark predation accounted for some of the dead. But when you subtract the men who went down with the ship, the men who drowned, the men who died of exposure, there are still bodies unaccounted for. Dozens of them, maybe more. The official explanation is simple: the sharks took them. But survivors describe things that don't match shark behavior. Men pulled straight down, not thrashing at the surface. Screams cut short, not prolonged. Shapes in the water that moved wrong. In 1945, these accounts were dismissed as hallucinations, delirium from days without water. But what if they weren't? The mission began as a routine scientific survey. A deep-sea research vessel named the Meridian, equipped with next-generation imaging systems, departed from Guam in early 2024. The goal was straightforward: create the most detailed 3-dimensional reconstruction of the Indianapolis wreck ever attempted, preserving her memory in digital form before the ocean consumes her entirely. The crew consisted of 12 specialists, deep-sea engineers, marine archaeologists, acoustic technicians, and notably 2 observers from the United States Navy. Their presence was explained as ceremonial because the Indianapolis remains a war grave and military oversight was appropriate. Nobody questioned it at the time. The Meridian carried a submersible drone designated Triton IV, 8 high-definition cameras, hypersensitive sonar arrays, and acoustic sensors capable of detecting a heartbeat through steel. It was the most advanced deep-sea imaging platform ever deployed on a military wreck site. During the final equipment calibration, 12 hours before the dive was scheduled to begin, the acoustic technician flagged an anomaly. The sensors were picking up a faint rhythmic pulse from the target coordinates. Steady, repetitive, almost mechanical. The most shocking fact is that sound should not exist at those depths, not from a ship that has been dead for 80 years. The chief engineer reviewed the data and dismissed it as equipment noise, interference from the support vessel's own systems, he suggested, or calibration drift. The mission would proceed as planned, but the technician saved the recording. He couldn't explain why. Something about the rhythm unsettled him. It didn't sound random. It sounded deliberate, like something down there was waiting. The descent began at 0600 hours local time. The Triton IV detached from its housing on the Meridian's underside and slipped beneath the waves without ceremony. Inside the cramped control room aboard the support vessel, 6 crew members monitored the feed. Banks of screens displayed depth readings, pressure gauges, sonar returns, and 4 separate camera angles. The pilot guided the drone downward with small adjustments of his joystick. There was no rush. The journey to the bottom would take nearly 4 hours. The thing nobody tells you about descending into the Philippine Sea is how quickly the world disappears. At 500 feet, the water was a deep sapphire blue, sunlight still filtering down in pale shafts. At 1,500 feet, the blue darkened to an inky twilight. By the time Triton passed 3,000 feet, all natural light was gone. The cameras showed nothing but blackness in every direction. The only illumination came from the drone's own running lights, small points of white swallowed almost immediately by the void. At 4,000 feet, they passed into what oceanographers call the abyssal zone. No sunlight has touched this water in millions of years. The temperature hovers just above freezing. The pressure at this depth could collapse a submarine's hull like a paper cup, and the Indianapolis was still nearly 3 miles below them. The crew monitored the descent in near silence, professional calm, routine checks. But there was tension in the room that nobody acknowledged. They all knew the history of this place. They all knew what happened in the water above them 80 years ago. You see, the sinking of the Indianapolis wasn't just a tragedy, it was a scandal. When Captain Charles McVay gave the order to abandon ship, he had no idea that rescue would take nearly 5 days to arrive. The Navy had failed to notice the ship was missing, failed to act on distress signals, failed at every level of communication and command. And when the nightmare finally ended, when the emaciated survivors were pulled from the water surrounded by circling sharks, the Navy needed someone to blame. Captain McVay was court-martialed, the only American captain in World War II to face such a trial for losing his ship to enemy action. He was convicted of failing to zigzag, a charge that the Japanese submarine commander himself later testified was irrelevant. McVay had followed protocol, the Navy had not. But the Navy writes its own history. McVay was publicly disgraced. He received hate mail from the families of dead sailors for decades. In 1968, he shot himself with his service revolver. It took until the year 2000 for Congress to officially exonerate him. What many overlooked in this story is the pattern of secrecy, the classified mission, the communication failures, the scapegoating. The Navy has always been protective of the Indianapolis narrative, controlled it carefully. The question that haunts researchers is simple: what else are they controlling? At 12,500 feet, the Triton passed the depth of the Titanic. The crew noted it quietly, a grim milestone. They were now deeper than the most famous shipwreck on Earth, and they still had another mile to go. The pressure outside the drone's titanium shell exceeded 5,500 pounds per square inch. A single flaw in the housing, a microscopic crack, would mean instantaneous implosion. The cameras would capture nothing. The crew would simply watch their screens go black. Then, at 14,000 feet, the acoustic sensors flagged an alert. The technician leaned forward, adjusting his headphones. The rhythmic pulse they had detected during calibration was back, clearer now, stronger, but it had changed. The original signal had been a steady tap. This was different. This was a slow, grinding scrape, metal against metal, dragging, deliberate. The technician's voice was flat when he spoke. That's not decay. Decay creaks. Decay groans. This is scratching. The pilot asked if they should abort. The mission coordinator hesitated for a long moment, then shook his head. They had come too far, spent too much. The Navy observers said nothing, but one of them was writing in a small notebook. The Triton continued its descent. The scratching sound grew louder with every 100 feet. At 17,800 feet, the sonar finally painted a shape on the screens. A massive angular form rose from the sea floor, casting a sonar shadow nearly 1,000 feet long. They had found her. The pilot activated the forward floodlights, and twin beams of brilliant white cut through the darkness for the first time in 80 years. What emerged from the black was not a ruin, it was a warship. The USS Indianapolis appeared almost intact from this angle. Her bow rose from the silt at a sharp angle, gun turrets still pointed forward as if ready to fire. Unlike the Titanic's melting Gothic decay, the Indianapolis looked military, functional, and frozen in her final act of defiance. Rust bloomed across her hull in dark red patches, but her lines were still clean, still sharp, still dangerous. The crew stared at the monitors in silence. Several of them had tears in their eyes. This was a grave. Nearly 900 men had died here, but the moment of reverence was short. Because the scratching sound was louder now, much louder, the acoustic sensors confirmed what nobody wanted to believe. It was coming from inside the hull. The Triton began its survey of the exterior hull, cameras recording every inch in stunning 8,000 pixel clarity. The torpedo damage was immediately visible. 2 massive wounds in the starboard side, exactly where the historical record placed them. The Japanese submarine I-58 had struck true. Metal peeled back like torn paper. Bulkheads collapsed inward. The violence of that July night in 1945 was frozen in steel. But as the drone moved along the hull, The cameras captured something else, something that wasn't in any historical account. There were marks on the exterior plating that didn't match the torpedo impacts. Long vertical gouges running parallel to each other, carved deep into the steel. They looked almost like scratches. Claw marks, if you wanted to be dramatic about it. The marine archaeologist leaned closer to her monitor and frowned. She noted that these striations weren't consistent with explosion damage or collision debris. The pattern was too regular, too deliberate. What many overlooked in the initial analysis was the marine growth surrounding these marks, or rather, the lack of it. The rest of the hull was covered in a thin film of bacterial colonies and deep-sea organisms. But the gouges were clean. The steel inside them was brighter, less corroded, as if the marks had been made recently. The chief engineer suggested anchor drag from the 2017 Discovery expedition. Perhaps a cable had scraped against the hull during that survey. The explanation satisfied no one, but they moved on. There was work to do. The Triton located an entry point near the collapsed midsection where the ship had broken apart during her plunge to the bottom. The drone's lights illuminated a jagged opening in the hull, twisted metal framing a passage into darkness. The pilot guided Triton through the gap with careful precision. One wrong move and the drone would snag on debris, ending the mission. The interior of the Indianapolis was a time capsule. 80 years of absolute darkness and near-freezing temperatures had preserved details that should have rotted away decades ago. The cameras captured a sailor's boot, still laced, resting against a fallen beam. A metal canteen corroded but intact. A calendar on a wall, its pages long dissolved but its frame still hanging at an angle. July 1945, the last month these men ever knew. The drone pressed deeper into the ship, navigating corridors that hadn't seen light since the night of the sinking, in what appeared to be a crew quarters. The camera lingered on a small object resting on a debris pile, a photograph in a metal frame. The image was damaged but still visible. A young woman smiling, someone's sweetheart, someone's wife, someone who waited for a letter that never came. The control room fell silent. These were not just artifacts. These were the last possessions of dead men. But the silence was broken by the acoustic technician. The scratching sound had changed again. It was rhythmic now, a slow, steady pulse, almost like breathing. He checked his instruments twice before speaking. The sound was emanating from somewhere forward of their position, toward the bow, toward the compartments that had once housed the ship's most secret cargo. The mission coordinator pulled up the deck plans on a secondary monitor, the forward magazine section. That was where the Indianapolis had stored the components for the atomic bomb during her final mission. Enriched uranium, firing mechanisms, the heart of the weapon that would end the war. The thing nobody tells you is that the cargo was successfully offloaded before the sinking. The nuclear materials made it to Tinian Island. The Indianapolis was empty when she went down, so the forward magazine should contain nothing. Just empty compartments and dead air. But something was making noise in there. The Triton navigated through two more collapsed sections before reaching the forward magazine area. The drone's light swept across a sealed hatch, still dogged shut after 8 decades. But adjacent to the hatch was an opening that should not exist. A section of bulkhead had been breached, not corroded through, not blown apart. The metal was bent inward, pushed from the corridor side into the compartment beyond. The edges were smooth, almost folded, as if something with immense strength had simply pressed its way through. The pilot guided the drone through the breach. The cameras adjusted to the darkness beyond, auto-focusing on the interior of the magazine compartment. What they revealed made no sense. The room was remarkably preserved. Too preserved. The metal surfaces showed almost no corrosion compared to the rest of the ship. The bacterial films that covered every other surface were absent here. The water itself seemed clearer, as if something was keeping the space clean. Then camera 2 caught it. On the opposite side of the compartment, there was another breach. This one was bent outward into the adjacent space. The most shocking fact hit the crew simultaneously. Something had entered this room through one wall and exited through another. The metal around both openings was bright, clean, recent. The scratching sound stopped. Total silence fell over the audio feed. For 3 long seconds, nobody breathed. Then the acoustic sensors detected something new, a low, resonant hum emanating from the darkness beyond the outward breach. It was not mechanical, it was not biological, it was something in between, a frequency that seemed to vibrate in the bones rather than the ears. The pilot pushed the drone forward, angling camera 1 toward the dark opening. The lights penetrated perhaps 10 feet into the space beyond, and for a fraction of a second, something moved. It was pale, smooth, fast. It crossed the frame so quickly that the human eye barely registered it, but the cameras captured 3 frames of footage, 3 frames that would later be analyzed, enhanced, debated, and ultimately suppressed. The feed cut to static, 3.2 seconds of dead air. When the image returned, the Triton was damaged. Camera 3 was offline, its housing cracked. The drone's orientation had shifted 90 degrees. It was now facing backward, toward the breach it had entered through, as if something had grabbed it, turned it around. And the hum was gone, replaced by silence so absolute it felt like pressure. Something was down there, and it knew they had come. If you're still here, you've just seen what the cameras captured 18,000 feet beneath the Philippine Sea. Something moved, something damaged the drone, and now you need to know what happened next. Comment 2 below if you're following this investigation, and if you haven't subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss the rest. Your support helps us uncover the stories that get classified and buried. Now, let's talk about what the experts found when they analyzed the footage and why the Navy suddenly shut everything down. The Triton was recovered 6 hours later, hauled back to the surface with 1 camera destroyed and its navigation systems corrupted. The crew gathered in the Meridian's main cabin to review the footage. The room was divided. Half the team believed they had witnessed a genuine anomaly, something unprecedented in the history of deep-sea exploration. The other half insisted there had to be a rational explanation: equipment malfunction, optical distortion, debris caught in a current. The marine archaeologist replayed the 3 frames of movement over and over, enhancing the image until it dissolved into meaningless pixels. She couldn't identify what she was seeing. It wasn't a fish, it wasn't a squid, it wasn't any organism in her extensive database of deep-sea life. The shape was wrong, the movement was wrong, everything about it was wrong. The acoustic technician had isolated the recordings of the scratching sound and the low hum. He ran them through every analysis program available on the ship's systems. The scratching matched no known biological signature, not whale, not dolphin, not the clicking of shrimp colonies or the groaning of tectonic plates. It was rhythmic in a way that suggested intention. Pattern recognition software identified a repeating sequence, but the sequence corresponded to nothing in any acoustic database. The hum was even more troubling. Its frequency was extraordinarily low, near the threshold of human hearing. The closest match in the system was the song of a blue whale, but the wavelength was compressed in ways that made no physical sense. Blue whales produce sound through air passing over vocal membranes. This sound seemed to emanate from something solid, something dense. The technician described it as the noise a tuning fork might make if it were the size of a building. The structural engineers examined the footage of the breaches with growing unease. The inward breach showed metal bent with tremendous force, but there was no impact crater, no sign of collision. The steel had simply been pushed aside, folded like paper. The outward breach was identical in character but opposite in direction. Their professional opinion was uncomfortable. Whatever caused this damage did so with sustained pressure rather than sudden impact. It pushed through the steel slowly, deliberately, and it was strong enough to treat inch-thick naval plate like aluminum foil. The Navy observers had watched the review in silence. When it concluded, they excused themselves and spent 3 hours in encrypted communication with Naval Command in Pearl Harbor. The rest of the crew was not informed of the content of these conversations. What they noticed was the change in atmosphere. The observers had been cordial, almost friendly during the voyage out. Now they were cold, professional. They avoided eye contact. Within 48 hours of the Triton's recovery, the mission was terminated. The official reason was equipment malfunction requiring immediate return to port for repairs. No further dives were authorized. The crew was assembled and informed that all footage, recordings, and sensor data were now classified under naval security protocols. Each member signed a non-disclosure agreement running to 37 pages. The penalties for violation included imprisonment. The official report filed with the Naval History and Heritage Command was 12 pages long. Its conclusion stated that the survey had been completed successfully, that comprehensive imaging data had been collected, and that no significant anomalies were detected during the expedition. The report made no mention of the acoustic signals, no mention of the breaches, no mention of the 3 frames of impossible movement. The footage was never released, but someone talked. They always do. Within 6 months, grainy stills began appearing on obscure online forums dedicated to deep-sea mysteries. Enhanced images of the inward breach, spectrograms of the scratching sound, a single blurred frame showing something pale against the darkness. The sources were anonymous. The authenticity was debated, but researchers who began digging into the history of the Philippine Sea found something disturbing. This was not the first time unexplained phenomena had been reported in these waters. A 1994 oceanographic survey documented persistent acoustic interference near the Indianapolis coordinates that they attributed to unknown geological activity. A 2010 Japanese research expedition reported anomalous sonar returns, suggesting a large moving object at extreme depth dismissed in their final paper as instrument error. A 2019 deep-sea biology survey noted unusual bioluminescence patterns in the area, flashes of light at depths where no known organism produces light, photographed but never explained. The thing nobody tells you about the Philippine Sea is what lies beneath it: the Mariana Trench, the deepest point on Earth. Nearly 36,000 feet of black water that humanity has barely touched. We have mapped less than 20% of this abyss. We have no idea what lies down there, and the Indianapolis rests at the edge of it, a steel tomb suspended above a darkness we cannot comprehend. What many overlooked in the rush to explain away the footage was a simple, terrifying possibility. Maybe we found something, or maybe something found us. Let us return to the story everyone thinks they know. July 1945. Sharks in the water. Hundreds of men torn apart over 4.5 days of hell. It is the most famous shark attack in history, recounted in documentaries and Hollywood films. The image is seared into our collective memory: sailors floating in life vests, watching fins circle, waiting for their turn to die. But the survivor testimonies contain details that don't fit the narrative. Details that were recorded in 1945 and promptly ignored. Multiple survivors described men being pulled straight down, not thrashed at the surface the way shark attacks typically present. Not dragged sideways, pulled vertically as if something beneath them had simply decided to take them. Screams that ended instantly rather than trailing off. Shapes in the water that moved with unsettling smoothness. Too large and too pale to be oceanic whitetips. One sailor described seeing something rise beneath a group of his shipmates and take 3 of them simultaneously. That is not shark behavior. Sharks are ambush predators. They strike individually. They do not coordinate. In 1945, Navy doctors attributed these accounts to delirium, dehydration psychosis, and saltwater poisoning. The men had been floating in the Pacific for days without fresh water. Of course, they saw things that weren't there. But what if they did see something? What if the sharks were not alone? The most shocking fact about the Philippine Sea is how little we understand it. This is one of the most biologically unexplored regions on Earth. Hydrothermal vents along the nearby Mariana Trench support ecosystems that exist nowhere else on the planet. Giant amphipods the size of footballs, transparent fish with teeth like needles, cephalopods that have never been classified. As recently as 2022, researchers documented species in these waters that had never been seen before, and most of the abyss remains unmapped. The depth where the Indianapolis rests exceeds the operational limits of most research equipment. We have sent precisely 5 humans to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. We have sent thousands to space. The honest truth is that we do not know what lives at 18,000 feet. We do not know what could survive in absolute darkness under crushing pressure, feeding on the slow decay of a steel warship. We do not know what might have made the Indianapolis its home. That is not speculation. That is the most accurate statement science can offer. The Indianapolis was supposed to be a closed chapter. 1,196 men sailed on her final voyage. 316 survived. Sharks and tragedy and naval disgrace. End of story. But the wreck is still there, resting at the edge of the deepest darkness on Earth. And something is still happening inside it. The official footage from the Meridian expedition has never been released. The audio recordings remain classified. The Navy has offered no explanation for the early termination of the mission or the extensive non-disclosure agreements signed by every crew member. The dead of the Indianapolis have been silent for 80 years. But the silence has been broken. What do you think is living in the deepest military grave on Earth? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Like,